Well, today on the show, I'm joined by Professor Graham Oppy and host of Majesty of Reason, Joe Schmid. Together, we come and talk about atheism and its philosophical roots. This is a really interesting survey of the topic and philosophy of atheism, and I hope it serves many as a way into this philosophical landscape, as well as a really helpful explanation and exclaimer around what atheism is and isn't, and how it should be approached in discourse. This was a fantastic conversation, and just one quick thing to note is that Joe has to join this conversation from his mobile phone. He did a stellar job in jumping off his laptop and jumping on his phone when he had some technical issues, but I'm yet to see the final version of this conversation. So if there are any issues with Joe's video, it's simply because he's having to jump on his mobile phone. And Joe, once again, I'm sorry things didn't work out quite as we expected, but thank you, mate, for being so flexible in jumping onto your phone and covering us that way. If you're new, I'd ask you to hit the subscribe button and then select the bell notification icon option. That means you'll be reminded whenever we release an episode, and you wouldn't mind giving this video a thumbs up. Anyway, I hope you enjoy Graham, Joe and myself exploring atheism and its philosophical roots. Cheers. Hello and welcome to another episode. My name's Sam and today I'm joined firstly by Joe Schmid from Majesty of Reason. Joe, my friend, it's good to have you back on the show. How's it going?
It's going well. It's great to be here and great to be with two guys here. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Also delighted to introduce Professor Graham Oppy. Graham, it's great to have you on the show.
Cheers.
So we've had this in the diary for quite a long time, I'm aware, and I've been doing quite a lot of prep in kind of getting ourselves to this point. But I won't kind of bore the audience with introductions. If they don't know who you are, they can go away and figure that out. Let's just jump into the good stuff. So I kind of wanted to throw this out there. I think probably passing to you straight off the bat, Graham, and then Joe, jump in whenever you want to, and we'll just kind of take it backwards and forwards. But I guess the first thing that I'd like to kind of understand really is kind of how we should understand the term atheism and atheist. Should they have strict definitions for this sort of conversation?
Okay, so in ordinary language, I think there are different ways in which people understand the terms. If you want to have a serious conversation, you probably want to get onto the same page with everybody else in the conversation about how you're using the terms. Now, in sort of analytic philosophy of religion, that's not a problem. There's a kind of standard way of defining, pretty much standard way of defining the terms. And so my suggestion is going to be that we'll just use the kind of standard way here. I'm not entirely sure where the conversation's going to go. I don't think that the definition should just be in terms of capital G, God, because we might branch out and talk about other gods. So atheism is just going to be the claim that there are no gods, and theism will be the claim that there are gods, and monotheism will be the claim that there's exactly one God, capital G God. And so that's atheism, and agnosticism, if we happen to have any reason to discuss it, will be suspension of judgment between atheism and theism. Okay, so there's a sort of straightforward way of using the terms. There are lots of people who use the terms differently, but if you're watching this video, that's how we're going to be using them, I think, unless I now get overruled by Sam and Joe.
Okay, so I guess to go a bit further, it'd be interesting to explore and possibly define the differences between weak versus strong atheism and kind of looking at what these categories mean. I don't know, Joe, do you want to jump in for this bit?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this distinction articulated in different ways by different people. So I'm just going to say that at the outset. The most prominent articulation I've seen distinguishes weak atheism in the sense of merely lacking a belief in God from strong atheism in the sense of believing that there are no gods. So lacking a belief in gods, to plural, to put it in Graham's terms. So the weak atheist, yeah, merely lacks belief, and that would include agnostics, as Graham Oppy just defined agnostics. And then strong atheism or strong atheists would include the people who positively have a belief that there are no gods. And so that's how I've seen this distinction cashed out. I'm not sure how helpful it is, and analytic philosophers of religion generally don't use the weak versus strong atheist language. They generally just stick in terms of atheist and agnostic and theist because it kind of carves up the conceptual terrain pretty nicely. You've got belief in a proposition, you've got disbelief in a proposition, or in other words, belief in its negation, and then suspension of judgment between those two. And that really nicely corresponds to those who believe that there is a God or gods, those are the theists. Those who believe that there are no gods, those are the atheists. And those who suspend judgment are the agnostics. It's a very clean characterization. And that's for that reason, I think analytic philosophers favor that. But there is this distinction, as you point out, between the weak and the strong atheists in popular parlance. I could just add to that there might be certain political reasons to include agnostics among the atheists. So in at least certain places in the world, there's significant discrimination against non-believers. There is suppression of their speech. There's a lot of stuff. There's negative connotations surrounding these sorts of people, and it might be politically advantageous to group in agnostics, basically all non-believers, into this common term, atheist, and then you can make further subdivisions. But that might be politically advantageous. It can provide a kind of unification. It can provide just resources for fighting back against that sort of oppression.
So while that's true, it is also worth pointing out that if you're going to have a category of weak atheists, you should also have a category of weak theists as well. People who just lack belief that there are no gods, right? And so your tent may actually include the weak theists as well.
Yeah, which is another reason why analytic philosophers generally dislike
Yeah,
this kind of
exactly.
characterization. It's just really unclear and messy, and it doesn't help. It only adds confusion, I think. Um, but again, it's worth recognizing that there are these usages, and that significant people online use it. And so, it's just best when you're having these sorts of conversations to just get clear what you're talking about from the get-go.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting. Like you're absolutely right. It's definitely kind of like the online realm, the space where people are trying to talk about beliefs and talk about where they stand and trying to mix these things up. But as you just mentioned, both just kind of proves very, very nicely that it does muddy the water and kind of produce this grey space, which isn't either white or black. It's undefined and therefore potentially quite treacherous as we explore. So I think kind of talking about how we define these terms, it'd be really interesting to kind of actually look at how atheism broadly and historically has been explored within philosophy. There's going to be obviously a whole wealth of prior ideas and thoughts that have brought us to the present day and kind of where we're talking about and where we're looking at. And this conversation obviously is really around sort of atheism and its philosophical roots, trying to look back and then kind of look to where we are and seeing where this has all come from. So Graham, kind of probably starting with yourself, if that's like all right, kind of the sort of broad and historical sweeps of atheism, where it's come from in the philosophical landscape.
Okay, so I'll start by pointing you to a distinction between what people had to say using the word atheism in the past and then how the past looks once you've adopted our way of thinking about atheists. So the word atheism came into English from French, I think, in about the 15th century. The word theism didn't enter English until about 100 years later. And atheism then was a very broad derogatory term that basically covered everybody who wasn't orthodox in their belief. And for a long time after that, you find philosophers and novelists and people worrying about atheism, and it's really not clear that their concerns are narrowing in at all on the thing that we would now call atheism. They're worried about kind of sort of heterodoxy in general. They're worried about apostasy. They're worried about heretics. They're worried about people who are just not very enthusiastic about religion and so on, a whole range of things. And there's a whole interesting history there. And it's got some connection to the eventual emergence of people who actually believe that there are no gods. and that's kind of interesting. But if we're going with the usage that we've adopted, I guess we're kind of interested in the emergence of people who are prepared to affirm that publicly, that there are no gods. And it's a kind of very slow burn getting to that point. And the places that I know the most about are the UK and France, and I guess we'll end up talking probably a bit about the UK, since that's the case I know the best. So that's just by way of very general introduction.
Yeah, Joe, how have you kind of like how when you look back at sort of I guess famous atheists throughout time and kind of how they kind of brought their thoughts to the fore, like where do you kind of start to map this out in yourself? Like where do you look at sort of that first emergence and then this sort of term becoming more and more defined and pushed forwards? Obviously, like kind of I look at think of people like Bertrand Russell, these sort of individuals that are quite well established, quite well known, that are quoted very often. Do you kind of look at the same sort of place, same sort of people, or kind of where do you kind of sketch that landscape?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I kind of what makes things difficult is that people believed in different sorts of gods and afforded them different roles. So, I mean, some people would trace atheism even back to like the ancient atomists and to like Leucippus and Epicurus and Democritus. They had this view of nature and reality where we could basically explain the goings on in the universe just by appeal to these tiny, uncuttable, indivisible, unchangeable, seemingly necessarily existent particles and their swerves. Basically, just there's particles in the void, and that explains the various goings on in reality. And while these ancient atomists generally did believe in the gods, they afforded them a kind of disinterested role. They weren't really interested in human affairs and these sorts of things. And a lot of these authors actually had certain scathing criticisms of religious practices. So do you categorize them as atheists? It's difficult, but that's kind of where I would sort of trace at least some of the intellectual heritage back to. I don't know what Graham thinks about that.
So there are other, even clearer antecedents in other cultures. So the Chavakas in India, it's pretty clear that they really were atheists in our sense. Uh, Unfortunately, the only records that we have of them were written by their enemies, and so they, in the writings, they're not painted in a particularly sort of pleasant light. But it is quite clear that they just said that there aren't any gods outright. And they were able to do that. I mean, it's interesting. There's a wide diversity of philosophical schools in India. You can find almost all philosophical positions, idealist, dualist, and as it turns out, materialist positions defended there. So that's one kind of antecedent. A different question, apart from this one about kind of what you can find in the philosophical tradition, is about whether there were people who had these explicit beliefs who just weren't philosophers. That's a much harder question to trace, though it's kind of interesting. The Chavakas basically fizzled out in about the 12th or 13th century, but they're referred to in some of the historical writings over quite a long period of time as people who, as philosophers who had the beliefs of common people, right? And that always struck me as a kind of interesting thing. It's not that all common people had it. It's just that you could find this amongst the unwashed and the unlettered, right? You could find people who were, as the Chavakas seem to have been, they were kind of consequentialists. They were, and they were materialists, and they just weren't religious. And I expect, though I got absolutely zero evidence for this, that right through history you'll be able to find people like that. If only, you could get into your time machine and go back and sort of unobserved, you could sort of have a look at what was going on. You would find people like that in all times and places. But that's just a guess on my part.
Yeah, and one reason why it's difficult is I think that there's a lot of like social and political pressure not to come out as an atheist, things like that. You'd get significant social pushback, but also oftentimes it wasn't even legal to express those sorts of ideas. So
Yeah. Okay. And so maybe to jump forwards to the kind of beginning where I would begin telling the story about the
Yeah.
UK. In the 17th century, there were various blasphemy laws that were introduced in different jurisdictions, which made it a capital offence to publicly affirm atheism. Now, this is a law that, as far as we know, wasn't enacted all that often. I mean, it's uncertain because while records were pretty good in major centres, so we know what happened in places like London and Edinburgh, out in the boondocks, we have no idea whether this law was sometimes enacted or not. But there was a very famous case in Edinburgh in 1697 when a university student at the University of Edinburgh was hanged under this law. His name was Thomas Aikenhead. It's not really clear that if the kind of political circumstances for the politicians and the religious leaders had been different, that he would have been put to death. But the fact was, the statute was on the books, and there were various people whose interests were served by having a hanging of an atheist, and so he ended up being put to death. And the time is kind of interesting. 1697, so Hume was born in 1711 in Edinburgh. Hume would have been perfectly well aware of what had happened to Thomas Aikenhead only 14 years before he was born.
Wow. Shows he's quite a bold and brave individual to then push ahead. I find it interesting as well, just really briefly looking back at sort of kind of ancient history. I find Stoicism to be an absolutely fascinating puzzle piece just for kind of everyday kind of contemplation. And a lot of the Stoics were religious in their sort of day and age, but actually if you kind of strip away some of that religiosity, you begin to see kind of very almost naturalistic kind of outworkings or thought patterns that they're kind of recognizing just the way things are and being in the present moment and those sorts of things. I do find it interesting. If we just, what I think would be quite interesting as well to do is just to kind of really fast forward now. I'd like to take us back up to the sort of mid-noughties, if you allow me, just for a brief moment. So around the mid-noughties, obviously kind of we had 9/11, a massive event that kind of then unleashed this idea of the sort of new atheist movement. I'd be interested just to get your take whether, because this has obviously been such a big phenomenon within sort of literature, as in there's lots of popular books that have been written by the sort of famous four individuals and others. It's very well known with on the internet kind of realms and circles and Reddit forums and these sorts of things. New atheism, that's sort of the atheism people want to wear as a badge at times, or especially did. I think the world's changed a little bit, but basically my kind of question is, does it mean anything within the sort of philosophical world? Because I imagine that it's more of a cultural feature than a deeper sort of swing within the philosophical study and discovery, especially seeing kind of who was the sort of leaders or at the front of this movement in the sort of mid-noughties. So new atheism, has it got any correlation to changes within the philosophical undertones, or is it really just a cultural phenomenon?
So I think historically there is a kind of interesting prefiguring of one aspect of the new atheists quite a long time ago. So the new atheists, yes, they were atheists, but they're also very anti-religion. And in some ways, I think that's their most distinctive feature. And in that respect, they haven't been particularly influential in philosophical circles. But if you go back to the deists, the origins of deism, so in the kind of shadows of the wars of religion in Europe, their view was that there's very little truth in the teachings of, say, Christianity. There's a God, you should be good, if you're good, there's a next life. But everything else is just falsehoods told you by priests, and in particular you should have absolutely nothing to do with religion. And that was deism was enormously influential in philosophical circles for the next couple of centuries, well into the right through, at least through to the end of the 18th century, from the time of, I guess not Herbert of Cherbury, but a bit after him, when his views started to get more traction. Now, nothing like that has happened this time around with the new atheists. There just isn't the same wave of enthusiasm for a view like deism being generated, or any kind of similar view. So that's one thought I had. to say in response to your question.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one thought that I was thinking is it doesn't, to me, it doesn't seem that New Atheism had a significant influence on philosophy of religion or the philosophical goings on. Certainly, it had a big cultural influence, social influence, political influence, and I see it more so as, yeah, a kind of cultural movement pushing back against the influence that religion has had and continues to have in the kind of public sphere. So, in terms of philosophy, it hasn't really affected all that much. I mean, a few papers have been published on the ideas of Dawkins and whatnot. So, just a few papers here and there, but it really hasn't influenced things all that much. I mean, maybe it has influenced the philosophical sphere indirectly by making it by kind of affecting the public sphere at large, but it didn't really affect it directly, the philosophical.
So,
Unless
so one
you
thing,
disagree with that, Graham.
yeah. So now one thing I'm reminded to say at this point, because Joe's here, we had a conversation with Eric Steinhardt only a few days ago, and Eric has a book on Dawkins' philosophy of religion, which is really kind of a fun read. So
We're saying that Eric has this book. That's what we're
Yes.
saying. This book. Okay, thank you, Joe. Okay, cool. Let's jump in. So then I wanted to. So we kind of covered that. I wanted to then move into. So I think, Graham, it'd be really interesting to kind of go into a little bit more around, I guess how philosophical atheism has tracked with culture. So we kind of mentioned kind of Edinburgh and UK and these sorts of places. Obviously, it began to kind of grow and change and has become an entire kind of well-established and well-respected field of philosophy, studied across the world and admired by many. So I would like to kind of just, before we kind of leave, I guess, the history section of this tour of kind of atheism, are there any other sort of key moments or figures that you'd want to speak about that kind of, I guess, touched a point with culture, kind of historically, and how their outworkings or thoughts around sort of philosophical atheism had that impact?
So there's a bunch of people here, some in France, some in the UK. And one person is Hume himself. And there's a lot of disagreement amongst philosophers about what Hume actually thought. My view, and I'm kind of tracking fairly closely with the views of Paul Russell, is that Hume was an atheist. And in the dialogues concerning natural religion, what he's actually doing is setting out a very strong argument against the existence of God. But it's dressed up in a dialogue form, and there's all kinds of red herrings, which mean that you have to work a bit in order to extract the argument. And I mean, you don't have to look very far. I already gave you the background that explains why Hume was very careful not to even publish the dialogues during his life. And his nephew and heir was instructed to publish it on his death. He wasn't prepared to have it come out before, and he was worried really about his social reputation, and with good reason. So he died in 1776. At that point, it was not socially acceptable in the UK. It hadn't been up until that point to profess atheism. There are kind of interesting cases. By reputation, some people thought of Hobbes as an atheist, but that was in the earlier sense that I was talking about. He just kind of had heretical ideas. But apparently there were some sort of wealthy young men who really were atheists. They weren't philosophers, they weren't kind of deep thinkers, but they'd kind of picked up in a sort of half-assed way from Hobbes a kind of materialistic atheistic aspect. So that's in the UK. I should add to that the first tract defending atheism that had the author's name on it came out about 5 years after Hume died. It was written by a Liverpool doctor, and it wasn't great philosophically, but it was sort of solid, right? And then there's a kind of period where other people are doing this. atheism didn't really get kind of traction and public sympathy until at all, really. I mean, even Shelley got sent down from Oxford for writing an essay defending atheism. It really wasn't until the 1820s when Richard Carlile started publishing all of the tracts that had been written by atheists in the preceding 30 or 40 years and kept getting jailed for it, that public sympathy started to swing towards atheism because he was being given such a shit time by the authorities, right? So, and after that, you'll start to find some philosophers, though really not many until into the 20th century, who are prepared to give defences of atheism. So that's in the UK. In France, the really interesting figure is Jean Melier, who was a Catholic priest. So he's born, I think, in about 60s, died in 1729. And in the last 10 years of his life, he wrote a kind of intellectual document. And his document was really interesting. It turns out that he was an atheist, and his most of the standard atheistic arguments that you find in, for example, the New Atheists are there in Melier. He was also an internationalist and a socialist and a kind of radical thinker in various kinds of ways. And he made 4 copies of his testament. That's the title that it eventually came to be called by. And somehow or other, the testament eluded the church authorities and was captured by people who started circulating them in Paris in the 1730s. So this was a kind of clandestine circulation. And they were enormously influential. So there's a whole generation of people after Melier who basically just republished what he'd done. So Holbach, Voltaire, though Voltaire took out all of the political stuff he didn't like, he pretended that Melier was a deist because Voltaire himself was a deist. So he edited it very stringently so it looked like it was that Melier agreed with Voltaire on a whole lot of things, when in fact, compared to Melier, Voltaire was a bit of a, I don't know what's the right word, a bit of a pussy, so right. And Descartes, the philosophy in the boudoir, is basically all the philosophical stuff is cribbed from Melier as well. So he's a really interesting figure. The other interesting figure is Holbach, even though he wasn't a particularly kind of innovative as a philosopher. He certainly had played a major role in pushing atheism forward. So he was very wealthy. He inherited money from his uncle, who made a fortune on the stock exchange, and he ran a salon in Paris, and everybody who was anybody was passed through his salon. He had a fantastic library. He had the best wine cellar in Paris. He had a great kitchen as well, and lots of interesting people would gather there, and their conversations were relatively free. Like you could say whatever you thought within the confines of the salon. And so there were some regular people, some of whom were atheists, and then just all these interesting people who went through there. And in the background, Holbach was a very prodigious writer, and he's writing lots of anonymous atheistic tracts that were circulating around Paris. Apparently none of the authorities knew that it was him, or if they did, they were prepared to put up with it because of, his public profile and so on. I mean, it's not really clear who knew. Hume went to the salon several times, and there's this story which I think is true, that Hume asked Holbach, do you think there's ever really been anyone who was an atheist? Now, why Hume would ask that question, I don't know. And Voltaire's reply is, sure, there's a bunch of them at the table. Right, so Melier is really a quite significant historical figure, I think.
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. So interesting, isn't it? I think I was speaking to a gentleman called Alec Ryrie just recently, who's a historian that's written quite heavily on the sort of I guess emotional side of atheism, especially kind of looking at the sort of 1700s onwards. And I think kind of one of the things he kind of says that's really interesting around this is the sort of undercurrent of shifting away from a belief in sort of classical kind of Christian God of especially the West at that time, kind of began to make people question, well, if you don't believe in God, then you believe in just yourself or something else, and these sort of extra sort of kind of curricular beliefs were labelled upon them. And atheism, as you already mentioned very articulately, Graham, was a slur, was something people would say to somebody. I mean, it's the same thing that the Romans called the Jews and the Christians atheists, because they had just one God, and that was atheistic almost in their sort of outworkings. So kind of looking at this sort of idea of atheism now, a sort of classic retort that a theist would make online, maybe more than just kind of in this sort of conversation, would be around, if you're an atheist, then you begin to struggle with tracking other things like morality or these sorts of things. So Joe, I've kind of got a question I want to kind of get your take on, and then maybe we'll pass back to Graham. But how does philosophical atheism interact with the philosophies of morality and ethics? Should we view atheism as a foundational philosophy, say, that directs other core areas of study? Very often a theist would want to claim atheism dictates everything, therefore that is the foundation upon which you stand. But I think it'd be really interesting to kind of get your take on whether that's true and how it does interact with things like morality and ethics.
Yeah, good questions. So it's often alleged by apologists and people on the internet that atheism is like a worldview or something like that, and it like infects a lot of these domains that you pointed out, like morality and meaning and so on. But I mean, atheism is certainly not a worldview. I mean, you can have fleshed out atheistic worldviews, like a kind of robust naturalism that Graham, for instance, develops. But there are also other different atheistic views, which could be supernaturalistic in character. They could be, I mean, there are just so many different ways you could flesh out an atheistic worldview. So atheism as such, again, is merely the proposition that there are no gods. A single proposition is not like a comprehensive worldview. If you combine that with various other theses, you might be able to get certain entailments about morality and meaning and so on, and then you're starting to have a fleshed out worldview. But atheism as such is definitely not a worldview. And in light of that, it's not entirely clear to me that atheism has like by itself sweeping implications for morality and meaning and so on, just because there are so many different theories in these domains which either make no reference to God, or which just don't have God as a grounding or don't require any of that. I mean, you could pick up any like meta-ethics book. So this is a Foundations of Ethics book by Russ Schaefer Landau and Terence Cuneo, and like you go through here and God is like mentioned not at all or like barely for all these different theories of the grounding of certain moral values and deontic properties, axiological properties, etc. So like the atheist can perfectly well accept a whole concoction of these theories, and they can ground morality in a whole concoction of different ways. And so for me, atheism doesn't have these implications that at least some apologists are wont to allege with respect to like morality. You know, you can't have objective morality, you can't have meaning or things like that. So I guess that's a brief thing. I mean, if you want me to get into the details of certain particular groundings of morality and normative theories and so on, I mean, I could, but I think I'd like to hear what Graham has to say on this.
Well, I agree with what you said. There's very little that follows from the claim that there are no gods without adding in some auxiliary hypotheses in order to start inferring. And from just the claim that there are no gods, I think nothing at all really much follows about morality. What might be ruled out is kind of divine command theories of morality, but at least in my view, they don't have much to recommend them. In particular, just to point to the kind of most obvious difficulty, there's no religious text that gives you comprehensive guidance about contemporary moral dilemmas. You have to apply to some subsidiary moral principles in order to get out definite guidance on many of the tricky moral dilemmas that we now face. And that just means that you've got to have some relatively independent moral theory to go along with the thing that was supposed to be your kind of fundamental moral theory, the divine command part, which just manifestly isn't.
Yeah, and I mean, it's sort of related to one of the criticisms that Russ Schaefer-Landau levels towards divine command theories. And it's a sort of modified Euthyphro dilemma put in terms of reasons. So, I mean, God either has reasons for commanding as he does, or he doesn't have reasons for commanding as he does. If he doesn't have reasons for commanding as he does, then his commands are just by definition arbitrary. They're not undergirded by any reasons. That's what it is to be arbitrary. Or, on the other horn of the dilemma, if they are undergirded by reasons, Russ Schaefer-Landau argues that, well, then, quite plausibly, reasons themselves that can give you an adequate account of the rightness or wrongness, or as it may be, goodness or badness of certain actions. It's those reasons themselves that God bases his commands off of. Maybe the suffering of the victim. Maybe the action violates certain universalizable principles. Maybe the action wouldn't be agreed upon by a fair decision situation in a kind of contractualist manner. Maybe it violates the flourishing and languishing conditions set by the intrinsic characters of the creatures, etc. So you can go through all these different potential groundings of certain either deontic or axiological properties. And yeah, anyway, it's just there's so many alternatives to divine command theory, and there's this problem with the reasons dilemma that
Right.
Russ Schaefer-Landau points out.
And one way of understanding what you just said is that the divine command part of it just drops out as a kind of fifth wheel to the coach. It's kind of
Yeah.
idle in the real explanation of what's right and wrong, good and bad, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, and so on.
Yeah, Mark Murphy also makes like a similar point where like God somehow has when God surveys the kind of non-moral landscape, the suffering, the pain, the flourishing and languishing of creatures and so on, when God surveys that landscape, he has decisive reason to command as he does. But somehow, when we look at it, like we don't have decisive, when we consider the suffering and when we consider these facts, like we don't have decisive reason to perform these actions, like we somehow have to get a divine command. It just seems really implausible that there would be this kind of a discrepancy there. But so anyway, Mark Murphy is another person to look at for reason-based criticisms along these lines as well.
No, I appreciate that. That's really interesting. I think so kind of where I want to take us to next then is we've already kind of mentioned weak versus strong atheism and how it's not particularly helpful. There's another term that's sometimes used, which is kind of hard atheism, so often defined as certainty that there is no God. I want to kind of touch on this because, again, it's used quite a lot when somebody thinks about atheists, and I want to look at it from the view of the burden of proof, essentially. So in relation to hard atheism, what should we do with the term certainty? So I feel that things like probabilities and possibilities might make more sense when it comes to trying to understand the term hard atheism. But often theists claim certainty needs to be held and then proved by the atheist philosopher. Should atheistic philosophers shoulder this burden of proof? Graham, what do you think?
So traditionally, there were views about knowledge which maintained that knowledge required certainty, and perhaps traditionally people might have been inclined to cast the sort of discussion about God in terms of what could be known and what couldn't be known, and that would make it look as though certainty is important to the discussion. There's also a question about, if we're going to talk about probabilities, about what certainty requires. And there is a kind of default view that many people go to that certainty requires probability 1, and that anything less than probability 1 isn't certainty. It's not clear that that actually aligns very well with kind of everyday notions of certainty. And there are kind of technical difficulties in the theory of probability about what to do with beliefs that really are probability one. What sorts of beliefs could you give probability one to, and what thereafter can happen? Because if you've got a belief of probability one, then it's kind of shielded from any evidential concerns. Evidence just can't affect it. And so the kind of traditional thought is, well, okay, so if something's going to be given probability one, you better know it a priori. You better know it independently of experience, right? And it's not clear that even theists typically want to say that you can know that God exists independently, just completely independently of experience. Some of them want to say that, but not all of them do. So even amongst theists, I think there are going to be people who admit that actually this probability isn't one. It's going to be kind of at least 1 minus epsilon. But that's some tiny quantity. But that's enough to count as practical certainty, or, it's not the kind of certainty that requires probability one. So that's one set of considerations here. Maybe I'll pause at this point and let Joe add something else.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about this question, I think just a little bit of clarity is needed on probability talk. I think that's just like systematically ambiguous, really. So many people just use probability differently. Some people use it as merely one's kind of subjective degree of confidence, so merely one's kind of personal credence. That is just basically how confident someone is on a scale of 0% to 100%, or more commonly 0 to 1. And that's a more kind of personal, subjective degree of belief, level of confidence sort of thing. And that's one notion. It's a very subjectivist kind of understanding. Another notion is like what degree of belief or what credence would be rational in light of one's evidence. So it's imposing further constraints. So like that's a notion of probability. There are still further notions of probability that are even more objective, that talk about like propensities of things or tendencies of things, or perhaps counting up ways that things could be, and then counting up the number of favorable outcomes among the total range of possible outcomes. So there are just so many different ways to precisify or disambiguate this probability talk. And once we get clear on that, then we can start to get clear on like certainty in atheism. Because someone might have just like a psychological certainty in atheism, but be totally unjustified in that psychological certainty. They might attach a credence one to the claim that there are no gods, but their evidence doesn't justify that sort of credence. Maybe their evidence only justifies like a 0.7 credence or something like that. So yeah, I just wanted to note that for the audience, just to keep in mind these different notions of probability whenever you're talking about certainty and so on. Our ordinary language talk is also really messy. I think sometimes we use probability to refer to one of these, other times we use probability to refer to another of these disambiguations. So I guess that's what I wanted to add to what Graham said.
So now that we've said that, go back and look at, say, Bertrand Russell. Russell tended to go backwards and forwards about whether he was an agnostic or an atheist. And why he kind of went backwards and forwards on this is partly to do with not being really clear on the nature of the probabilities involved and so on. So he kind of thought, well, I can't go probability one, right? That would be kind of irrational, right? On the other hand, but then that means if we're thinking that probability one is a standard for atheism, I must be an agnostic. And so he would say, I'm an agnostic in the sense that I'm also agnostic about whether Julius Caesar actually existed or not. To use Russell's own example. But if you go with the and still just thinking in kind of fairly naive probabilistic terms, Russell presumably was nearly certain, like his probability was 1 minus epsilon. And surely you would think you didn't even have to be that gung-ho. Like if you were 70%, there are no gods, that's surely enough to make you an atheist, you might think. Mm-hmm. Right. And the idea that we're going to force on atheists that they have to be certain, that they have to give probability one or probability 1 minus epsilon, just seems really weird to me. No, if not to say just completely mistaken.
Yeah. And there's another distinction here for the audience that's really important. And it's a distinction between belief and credence. So belief is oftentimes taken to be a relatively like binary state of mind or propositional attitude, an attitude that we adopt towards a given proposition. And you basically believe something when you take it to the case, you affirm it as true, you represent the world as being the way that the proposition describes. So you can either believe something, you can disbelieve something, or you can suspend judgment on the matter, you can suspend your belief. And that, I think, gives you a really nice way of carving up the atheist, theist, agnostic terrain. And then we just set aside considerations of credence, right? So credence is not binary in that way. You either believe or you disbelieve or you suspend. Credence is like a scalar. It's from 0 to 1, right? And so you might have a whole number of different credences despite the fact that you still believe it. So someone might believe that there are no gods and have a credence 1. They might believe that there are no gods and have a credence 0.8. They might have a whole bunch of different credences. And that makes it, I think, it makes it really weird to define atheism in terms of credence when we have this really clean characterization in terms of belief. And then we could just let the credence considerations kind of fall by the wayside. Of course, credence considerations, that will affect, you might think there's a certain threshold credence you need to meet in order to be justified in believing. So maybe it's something above 0.6. I don't know. No one knows, I don't think.
No, so that,
but like
that last point's quite important. There just isn't a kind of neat way of matching up the credence talk with the all or nothing belief.
Yeah. Which is, another reason why it's important to, I think, carve up the conceptual terrain, or at least by my lights, it's most theoretically useful to carve up the conceptual terrain in terms of belief and just set the credence considerations by the wayside. And so atheists don't need to have credence 1. They don't need to have credence 0.9. They just need to believe. They need to represent the world as being such that there are no gods. That's the cleanest way to do it. And I think, yeah.
I guess the only sort of caveat I want to kind of just ask, this might just be me being kind of foolish, is for somebody to kind of obviously have that binary position, either yes or no against a proposition, they're going to need to have weighed the probabilities and possibilities of a presented God. So it could be that, let's use the God I'm familiar with, the Christian biblical God, although that has changed. The definition of that has changed over time as well. So that's a tricky one. But going with sort of classic Western concept of this sort of omni-God, obviously those different things kind of, you add those into the scales, and then you kind of begin to recognize you either are affirming that, you're agnostic about that, or you're denying that. So I guess kind of those probabilities and possibilities work behind the scenes in some sort of scale or weigh system to enable your minds to potentially, actually through no choice of your own, sit within one camp or the other camp, and then from that place either kind of realize that binary decision might have actually occurred without you even really making a decision. I don't know, does that make sense?
So one question here is about the extent to which we really do attribute even probabilistic intervals to propositions, never mind precise numerical figures. If you ask me about lots and lots of claims, I can tell you whether I believe them or not. If you ask me what's my credence, if I'm going to answer that question at all, I'm just going to have to make something up, right? Right. Yeah. So you ask me what's my credence that there are no gods, and maybe in that case I'm going to say, it's 1 minus epsilon, but that's just me. I'm kind of an unusual case. But even that wasn't a precise number. But you asked me about lots of other things. So I don't know. This is kind of a dumb example. What's the likelihood that Arsenal are going to win the league this year? I'm not going to give you a number.
I have a credence there. I think it's at least for me, it's 0.4 right now as we speak. But that might change later. I've got a 0.4 credence in that. Unfortunately, City has 0.6, but I'm a big Arsenal fan, so.
Funny. Okay, so I want to kind of turn to meaning and purpose, that sort of really slippery substance that is really hard to talk about within philosophy. But I think it's good that we had a question, or a couple of people asking about this on Twitter, and I kind of had it kind of wrapped up in a question already. So, Joe, I'm going to throw this one at you first, just so you're aware. Get ready for it, mate. So, what tools within philosophy do philosophers of atheism employ to explore meaning and purpose? People historically have talked about things like utilitarianism or hedonism, for example, but these terms don't seem to stretch far enough, in my opinion. So, yeah, what sort of tools do we have at our disposal?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking it may have been a mistake to send it over to me because sometimes I pull a Peter Van Inwagen when I get thrown the question of meaning or purpose. Like Peter Van Inwagen is kind of notorious in philosophy for very often saying, "I don't understand what you're saying," or like I just for just throwing up his hands and be like, "That's not clear enough to me. I don't understand what you're saying. You either need to precisify it or," and that's kind of like with me with meaning talk and purpose talk. Like, what is the meaning of our lives? What is the purpose of our lives? It's very difficult for me to know what we're talking about unless we like precisify that in some way. Like, do we mean by that? Is there some intention behind the universe's existence or our existence? There's some sort of intention or goal or something like that, some sort of like intention of a mind or some sort of purpose for which we were created. And what I want to say is like every atheist is going to say no to that just by dint of their atheism. I mean, you could in I guess you could have like a sort of weird non-theistic being which somehow created the universe and gave us a purpose, or maybe we could have like a sort of simulation type example where we're just simulated beings, and so there are our makers or whatever. But setting aside those weird possibilities, uh, most atheists are going to say no, of course there's no meaning or purpose in that sense. But if by meaning or purpose you mean something more along the lines of just like, I don't know, objective, objectively good ways that we are to live or that we ought to live, or like valuable things to do. I understand what that means, and I can talk about that. I'm just going back to our conversation about moral objectivity, and I think that there are countless non-theistic theories of morality and both the deontic properties of rightness and wrongness, as well as the axiological properties of goodness and badness. So um, it just depends on how you precisify the meaning and purpose talk. And on one common way, I mean, obviously not for the atheist. No, there's no meaning in that sense. But on another way, yeah, there can definitely be meaning in that sense. It's just what's good and bad and right and wrong, and what's valuable and disvaluable. And there are facts about that are independent of us and that we try our best to discover and live our lives in accordance with. So um, I don't know what Graham thinks about this, but that's my sort of deflationary answer.
Yeah, so I mean, just picking up on the second half of that, I'm happy enough to talk about people leading better and worse lives, people having good lives, people not having good lives, people who just, for whatever reason, um, it kind of pulls on them and they kind of find their existence to be meaningless, versus people who find that their lives are full of value and, in this sense, meaning, right? And the the kind of, whether you're a theist or an atheist, just cross cuts the category of people who, for whatever reason, kind of lost the will to live versus people who find their lives worth pursuing. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one thing that I would add is, sometimes I hear this talk and it sounds a lot like this talk of purpose and meaning and so on, and it really seems like people are getting at like the well-being debate, like what makes for a good or bad life, or um, in virtue of what do lives go well, or in virtue of what do lives go poorly. And then yeah, you got a bunch of different theories there, but the vast majority of them make no reference to God. I mean, you've got like desire satisfaction theories, like your life goes well to the extent that more and more of its central desires are satisfied. You've got um, more hedonic kind of theories where it's the goodness or badness of your life is mostly a function of the pleasure and pain that you experience. You've got objective list theories where there are certain like objective values that make your life go better, even if they may not satisfy your desires and even if they don't give you pleasure. So perhaps things like friendship and knowledge of important truths and uh, cultivating virtue and things like that, in valuable projects. So most of these theories, like objective list theory, and you can have crosscuts. I mean, I kind of like theories that are kind of in between some of these. Uh, but like most of these theories make no reference to God, and I mean, it's an interesting debate to ask what makes a life go well. But Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to see what God kind of adds to this. I mean, sure, it'll add certain values. Like you might think there's valuable relationship with God to be had, but I mean, merely from the fact that you're missing out some of values that would obtain were God to exist, it doesn't follow that there are no values under the atheistic worldview. I mean, you still have friendship, knowledge, love, virtue, and I think that these things, by my lights, are just intrinsically valuable. So, um, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah. So, so I would just agree with what Joe said. I mean, in some of my writings, I've talked about the way that Aristotle thought about the good life. I mean, he had some things wrong, but I mean, if you want to give a really kind of crude version of his view, he's just saying what Joe just said, really. Um, the kind of good life, a good life involves exercise of virtue, including to the extent that you're capable of it, intellectual virtue, practical virtue. A good life also involves a certain amount of luck. You can be crushed by misfortune and then you're unlikely to lead a good life, and etc. Just stuff that's got nothing to do with God. And I mean,
yeah, and
Aristotle was no theist in any sort of contemporary sense.
yeah, and just to add on to that further, like I don't hear anyone going around saying like you need God to be like a standard for the flourishing of plants, right? No one says that. No one thinks that. But like, at least one might think under certain views in the philosophy of biology like that there is a way for certain plants to flourish and there is a way for certain plants to languish. Like it's just kind of obvious if you just look at like a vibrant green plant which is bearing fruit and so on versus one that's withering and brown and all crumbly and so on. There are ways set by its intrinsic nature or character for it to flourish, and we could discover that empirically. We can look at that, and we can see that it's flourishing in certain ways. No one thinks that you need like God to secure the standard for how plants flourish or how they don't flourish. And so, I mean, similarly, I mean, we could just look at humans. We can perform certain empirical tests. We can learn how certain things contribute to human flourishing and how other things contribute to human languishing. And that's kind of all we need, honestly. Just as you don't need God for plant flourishing, I don't think you need God for human flourishing. Um,
Yeah, interesting. Let me throw this sort of line out and see if there's any sort of bite to be taken from it, and just give me a moment to kind of sketch the picture, I guess. So, talking as an ex-theist myself, so I guess the sort of big overarching picture that I've seen is that growing up as a Christian, you're presented with a worldview which very much says that the best way to live is by kind of following these principles and these mechanisms which have been handed down to you from this source, this deity. And I guess as I begin to look back throughout history and time, it seems that the human condition has very much required the crafting of story and narrative to help certain groups of humans in different pockets of the world to begin to craft narratives as a whole, as a collective, and then to live their meaning and value and purpose out into that space. I think kind of trace that through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, really, within the hominin line, and you get to where we are today, and it seems we're in a new space potentially, and push back if you think that I'm wrong, where it's becoming more and more the norm for people to hold the position atheism and rejecting the principle or the idea of God, whatever language you want to use, and a lot of people, I guess, are coming to this space from a fresh position of having believed or having been brought up in that space of belief. I know, Graham, you'd mentioned before about kind of Methodism kind of being where you were originally raised and your family sitting within. And when that's taken away, there's this space of almost, I guess, nihilism potentially, or at least some sort of kind of form of reduced purpose or meaning that means that somebody isn't able to look ahead. So I guess my sort of final line, as I mentioned, see if there is any bite left, is, are there anything that, or is there any sort of philosophical tools or methods people can use to begin to, I guess, drop away from that? I almost feel like it's a biological inbuilt desire to have meaning and purpose handed to us. Maybe that's just how I was raised, right? But is there any sort of kind of space here for any more kind of daylight to be shed in this conversation? Or do you think that I've kind of just wrapped that up neatly and we should move on? What are your thoughts?
Okay, so there's a lot to discuss there. I want to start with one very small thing. I don't think that we know much about the beliefs of our hominid ancestors much before the time when we discovered writing. because very hard. Like there's evidence that we buried the dead that goes back a long way, and sometimes we buried them and we left kind of treasured items with them. And maybe that's some kind of evidence that afterlife beliefs go back further than the beginnings of writing. But that that people believed in gods is a kind of interesting question. Now, I don't know what the kind of scientific or expert opinion is on this matter, but I would expect that it would be divided and that people would be rather uncertain about the extent to which there really is this kind of long lineage that goes back, say, 200,000 years, where kind of the parameters of various sort of social parameters are set by gods. Sorry, people believe that there are gods that want them to behave in certain kinds of ways. So I think that's kind of up in the air. I think what's more plausible is that sort of since what some people call the axial age, there's a bunch of religions in different cultures that turned out to become kind of global religions that do fit something like what you just said. But yeah, anyway, so that was the first point that I wanted to make, and maybe I'll give Joe a chance before we come back.
My only thought on this, and I want to hear some other things that you want to say on this, Graham, but my only thought on this is that I think a lot of people who grow up in, so Sam, you were talking about people sort of growing up in these things, and they think that, once they leave these belief systems like Christianity or Islam or what have you, that, they might be thrown into a kind of nihilism or something along those lines. To me, I think that they're falling into their religious ways of thinking. They've thrown off certain aspects of their religious ways of thinking, but they've retained other ones, and they need to get rid of those. So in their previous worldview, uh, God was the legitimator of morality. My phone right here is being propped up by a book written by Peter Berger. It's called The Sacred Canopy, and he introduces this notion of legitimation in there, and it's basically something along the lines of God is providing the grounding or the justification. He's legitimizing morality by like by the religious individual's lights, at least by a number of their lights. And if you preserve that, but you take away other aspects of their religion, well, then if someone preserves that belief that God is a legitimator of morality, well, then once you remove God from the picture, well, then yeah, there's no legitimator of morality, and you lose morality, and you lose meaning, and you lose all that stuff. But it's like, what I would suggest to these individuals is that once they get rid of God, they should recognize that no, after all, God was not the legitimator of morality. Something else is the legitimator of morality. Maybe, like we've gone through a number of different proposals here, like maybe it's certain principles that are universalizable, or maybe it's the intrinsic nature and character of sentient beings and their flourishing conditions, or maybe it's, etc. You go through the bunch of different potential theories. So I would urge them to resist that very religious thinking that they haven't yet kind of cast off. They've cast off God, but they haven't cast off God being the legitimator of morality. And I would just say, if you got rid of the former, why not get rid of the latter? Because to me, it seems just as mistaken.
So there's a kind of other thing that you can say to these people too that they might find helpful, which is that we have an awful lot of social scientific data about the flourishing and absence of flourishing, departures from flourishing in people in different cultures all over the world. And it's broken down statistically broken down to a very fine level so that you can work out by looking at this data whether there are actually correlations between having very strong religious beliefs or having religious beliefs at all and doing better when it comes to, say, suicide rates or murder rates or levels of mental illness or incarceration rates and so on, right across the board, all the things that you think are indicators of social well-being. And the very best that you can say about this data is that it provides no support whatsoever for the idea that people who don't have religion or who are atheists do worse, perform worse than people who are religious, who do have belief in God, right? And so you kind of have a very strong empirical argument that actually pull out the religious mat from underneath people, and they don't descend into a kind of nihilistic orgy. It just, right, that's just not how it goes, right? And you've got a massive amount of data. But after all, there are kind of, whatever it is, 7 billion of us now, and the data surveys most of them. Right, so that, I mean, so that's another consideration that I would add to the kind of more theoretical point that Joe made.
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favourite podcast app, and whilst you're there, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description, and thank you. No, I appreciate that, both. Thank you. That's fascinating. Okay, let's push back in. So, this next question, really, I guess the sort of overarching question is: over the last few hundred years, has science proven atheism? So the sort of question goes: does atheism gain anything from the corrosion of the classic idea of libertarian free will, or science seeming to favour determinism more and more over the last few hundred years? So really, it's kind of going into, are there certain aspects of scientific discovery which have begun to potentially point to the idea of no God, and therefore atheism being more likely than not?
Joe, you can go with this one.
Oh man, there's so much to say on this one. So we can distinguish between potential tensions between the findings of science and God's existence on the one hand, and then findings of science, or potential tension between findings of science and particular religious tenets and doctrines on the other hand. Those two are separable and should be kept separate. You might have conflict between findings of science and certain religious tenets, even though you don't have, by dint of that tension, a tension between the findings of science and God's existence, okay? So distinguish between God's existence and certain religious tenets. I do think that as we've learned a lot more about the world around us, the natural world around us, certain religious tenets have totally fallen by the wayside, and for good measure. So young earth creationism, things like that. I mean, we just know through standard evolutionary biology as well as standard cosmology that the universe is roughly our local spatiotemporal manifold began to expand roughly 13.8 billion years ago, and the Earth is about 4.54 billion years old, and there's an evolutionary process that spanned around 4 billion years. So that just doesn't square with young earth creationism, of course. So there's definitely tension between certain religious doctrines and the findings of science. But as for tension between the science and theism, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure the science itself would be able to deliver that, even though you might be able to conjoin certain philosophical arguments with scientific findings in order to deliver that. So, for instance, one such philosophical argument might take the findings of evolutionary biology and construct an evolutionary argument from evil against theism on the basis of that. So someone might think that it's very implausible that a perfectly provident, omniscient, omnipotent, fully good being orchestrated a creation in which it's basically a bloodbath where animals rip each other to shreds and prey on one another and engage in parasitism and so on. You'd think that there are lots of other ways to accomplish this being's creative ends than such a bloodbath, and that it's very implausible that a being did that. So, we're using scientific findings to inform a philosophical argument, or at least philosophical considerations, against the existence of God. Similarly, you might do that with a kind of materialist account of persons. Some people argue that certain very tight connections between neurophysiological goings on in the brain and mental states gives us at least some reason to think that either mental states are fully grounded in, or maybe reducible to, or maybe even identical to brain states. And you might think that that challenges not only religious conceptions of the soul, but you might think that's some evidence for a kind of naturalistic view in relation to a theistic view. You might think God would have some reason to produce like a kind of substance dualist universe where beings are more like him and in his image, whereas you think that substance dualism would be very, very improbable under kind of naturalistic worldviews. So naturalism would predict this data better than theism. You might think that. So anyway, long story short, I'm just saying that the scientific considerations alone, it's difficult to see how they challenge God's existence. But when you combine them with certain philosophical considerations, you at least have interesting considerations to contend with. I'm interested to hear what Graham thinks about all this.
So I agree with both of the things that you said there. I mean, I think if you, I mean, to go back to the deists, and if you pare back the view even further, it's hard to see how you're going to get something out of science. So suppose science tells us that there's a multiverse, right? It's hard to see how there's anything in the science that's going to say, and by the way, there's no God that made the multiverse, right? Yeah. It's very hard to see. Right, now, you might not have much positive reason to believe there is such a God, but it doesn't look like the science is going to tell you that there isn't. And perhaps if you added in more assumptions of various kinds, you might come up with reasons why, on the basis of the science, certain hypotheses about what God's like then become implausible. So I kind of like the kind of bloodbath example, and this idea that maybe that's going to cast doubt on the existence of a kind of morally perfect God, but hardly touches the hypothesis that there's a morally indifferent or morally slightly awful God at all. Right. And you need to rule those hypotheses out too before you rule out gods. Right. And it does seem as though you can, I mean, if you're really concerned to preserve the idea that there's a God, and you're not at all concerned to preserve kind of traditional views about God, that you can tailor your view about the moral attributes of God and the capacities of God and so on, so that it fits with the data that we've got. Right. So it's going to be very hard to rule out all gods.
Yeah, exactly. And going back to Sam's question of specifically about like determinism and libertarian free will, there's also a lot to say here. So like there are a lot of theists who don't believe in libertarian free will. I mean, if you hang out around a lot of popular Christian apologetics, libertarian free will is just like a staple in so much of what they argue. But if you, because they bring up like free will defenses, which rely on like, at least as they articulate them, they rely on libertarian free will, and they use libertarian free will basically left and right. But if you dig into the philosophical literature, actually, like, theists are very divided on whether or not they think there's libertarian free will. There are tons of theistic compatibilists because they think that God, as a perfect being, would have to have full control over what created reality would be like. And they think that in order for that to be the case, they argue that God would really have to be the one determining. He'd have to have a kind of deterministic, meticulous providence over the precise goings on in creation. And so on the basis of this, they develop compatibilist views of free will, and they accept them. So there are lots of theists that are perfectly happy with compatibilism. And I mean, there are also lots of theists who don't like compatibilism and who are libertarian free will proponents. And there are some who even don't believe in the existence of free will.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So these considerations about free will, while interesting, and I think they do bear on certain like responses to the problem of evil, and they do bear on our conception of human nature and persons and our place in reality. They do bear on that, but I think you can have a satisfying theism, a relatively intellectually satisfying theism that is libertarian in nature or compatibilist in nature with respect to human freedom.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. That's so interesting. Okay, so this one's from Twitter, so thanks to the Real Atheology podcast for this. So this is to both of you. Let's start, Graham, with yourself. So here's the tweet word for word. What are your thoughts on analytic thinkers like J.H. Sobel, J.L. Mackie, Paul Draper, Quinton Smith, Richard Gale, and their influences on atheistic philosophy?
Okay, so on that list, the one that was mentioned first, J.L. Mackie, stands out as one of my philosophical heroes. I think that his book, The Miracle of Theism, is just an amazingly good book. And it was one of the first books that I read in philosophy of religion. It was assigned as a text in the very first course that as an undergraduate, that I took, um, um, that studied philosophy of religion. And I think that very many people amongst theists who are interested in philosophy of religion think of Mackie's book as super impressive. And if you ask people like Rob Coons and Alex Proust, people like that, they might say, if you're going to read one book that's kind of shows you the strengths of atheistic philosophy, you should read Mackie's book. Okay. Sobel's book is Sobel also has a big book that's very good, Logic and Theism.
That's
But
one of my favorites.
but I yeah, I'm going to say why. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it differs from Mackie's book. So Mackie's book is pretty comprehensive. If you consider the subject matter, kind of consider the state of debate as it was at the time. So Bell's book has a narrower focus than Mackie's. It covers a smaller range of topics, but unlike Mackie, Sobel is adept at kind of using symbols, right? He's got much more kind of logical facility, and so there's a way in which his discussions of particular topics are more comprehensive than Mackie's were, and more precise, more exact. And so, amongst a certain subsection of the kind of atheistic community, obviously including Joe, but also including me, we have a kind of special appreciation of Sobel's book as well. It's a kind of masterpiece of its kind also. So those two people, for me, are super impressive. That's not to say that there aren't lots of other people who've worked in philosophy of religion as academics since then, or sort of contemporaneous with them, who aren't also super impressive. But I think that list is quite long. There are people like Evan Fales, whose work is always wonderful. Greg Dawes, I think his work's very impressive. And it's kind of invidious now that I've started naming names. There's dozens of others that I should add to that list, but I'll stop at this point.
I don't have too much to add to that, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, I definitely. I mean, J.H. Sobel's Logic and Theism is probably my favorite non-theistic philosophy of religion book, just that there is. So definitely that, and I agree with what Graham said about it, and I could heap praise on it all day, but we're not in for that. Especially the parts where, I mean, he has a very good discussion, I think, in general, of Aquinas. Unlike a lot of other people who get Thomistic cosmological arguments badly wrong, Sobel really gives them care, attention, and his analysis is quite illuminating. And he develops a kind of existential inertialist criticism of them. And I think that that's probably the most salient and relevant criticism of these sorts of arguments. And he got there before like almost everyone else, and it's just great. So I cannot recommend Logic and Theism enough to people. So uh, okay. As for the other people on the list, they're sadly underrated in like popular discussions. Like you'll never hear people in popular discussions talk about Evan Fales' work, but they should because it's really, really good. Uh, I should probably talk about it more on my channel. So yeah, definitely. I mean, I can commend and recommend those other people. I guess I'll add a special note for Paul Draper because he's one of my kind of philosophical heroes, and I got the privilege of studying with him at Purdue. So yeah, and I've had him on my channel as well to talk with Josh Rasmussen, another one of my philosophical heroes. So yeah, It's an amazing list, and I recommend anyone who's interested in these debates to check out these people's work. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, James. That was fantastic. Okay, so this is going to be a good one, I think. What are some of the biggest mistakes people often make when talking about atheism within the philosophy of religion? Graham, let's start with you.
That's a really hard question to answer, I think. So only maybe it depends. Maybe we need to identify a group of people who make certain kinds of who have kind of mistaken ideas. Maybe the biggest mistake, so maybe I'll try running with this, is thinking that there's a kind of unified, homogenous class of people who are the atheists. And the thing that stands out the most to me is how different, even within philosophy of religion, the people who identify themselves as atheists are. And if you compare, say, Sobel with Eric Steinhardt, they're very, very different philosophically. And the idea that there's kind of some short thing that you can say that's going to kind of slap them both, knock their heads together or something, it's very implausible. Okay, so there's the thing.
That is, I mean, that's one that was going to come to mind for me as well. And yeah, it's treating atheism as this kind of monolithic philosophical system or worldview. And we've already seen why that's mistaken. Atheism is just a proposition. And you can combine with that single proposition about the non existence of gods, you can combine with that whole concoctions of different worldviews. Eric Steinhardt, which you mentioned, he has a very sorry, Eric, if you're listening to this, but it's a very metaphysically profligate worldview. I'll just say that. And I mean, it's got like the Neoplatonic one. So it's very Neoplatonic. It's very Platonic. It's got like the form of it's got the forms, it's got abstract objects, it's got the form of the good, it's got the Neoplatonic one, which is like this absolutely simple transcendent reality. It's not personal, it's not God, by the way, which is one criticism that many people have leveled towards like the Thomistic God, that it's not really personal. I mean, it's just this absolutely simple transcendent reality. But Steinhardt goes as far as to say, you know, there's this absolutely simple transcendent reality, but it's not personal, it's not conscious, it's not perfect, it's not anything like that. He has like this iterative infinite hierarchy of sets within his ontology, and you know, it's really interesting. And so he's just this like radical Platonist, you could kind of say, like Neoplatonist, radical Platonist, uh, total realist about abstracta, total mathematical realist, total realist about moral values, total like full blown realism of like as much realism as you can want, basically. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you'll have atheists who prefer like super duper crisp desert landscapes where they're like nominalists, they're moral anti-realists, they are you know, they're like mathematical fictionalists or whatever. They you know, they don't think that they're like identity theorists or you know, various other kind of more desert landscapey views. So you'll on all these different issues, you'll find atheists on different sides. You will find atheist substance dualists. You will find atheist property dualists. You'll find atheist neutral monists. You'll find atheist identity theorists. This is with respect to consciousness. They're not all materialists, okay? Uh, you'll find atheist panpsychists. You'll find atheists who believe in abstract objects. You'll find just it's all across the space of possible views. Moral realists, anti-realists, they're everywhere. Okay, so people need to stop treating atheism as just like a package deal, and you have to be an anti-realist, you have to be an identity theorist or some sort of materialist, you have to disbelieve in abstract objects. No, none of that follows. So that's one of the biggest mistakes, is treating atheism as monolithic, and I dislike that because yeah, I mean, I I go here and there with some of these things, you know, like I'm a moral realist, and you know, like I go here and there. So, um, anyway, that's a big mistake. I could go on other mistakes, but I think that's perhaps the biggest.
Yeah, I like that. I like it. Graham, any more thoughts before we move on to the final question?
I'm curious to know if Joe thinks that what else would be a mistake on that same scale that people make about atheists. I mean, maybe there are people who, I mean, in the philosophy of religion community, who deep down think that there's something morally suspicious about atheists, that atheists are just bad people. And to the extent that that's right, I think of that also as being a mistake for reasons that we've kind of already discussed. As far as the evidence goes, there's no evidence that supports the claim that atheists are worse than other people. Maybe there are tiny bits of evidence that suggest that in some ways they're somewhat better. But anyway, I'll leave that. Having thrown that
Yeah,
out
I
there, I'll
mean,
just leave that there.
yeah, I mean, we can kind of disentangle common mistakes that people in general have about atheists versus common mistakes that are made in philosophy of religion about atheists. Yeah, I mean, with respect to like people in general, like some people think atheism is a religion. I mean, it's so obviously not. There aren't any rituals. There aren't costly sacrifices that you make. There isn't commitment to like either some ultimate reality or, getting away from certain karmic structures or anything like that. So it's definitely not a religion. Um, and there's another one where like atheists are immoral or bad or things like that. But I think that the more interesting ones, which aren't like obviously false, the more interesting ones are like the ones in philosophy of religion. And I'm trying to think of other potential problems because this is our opportunity to highlight certain trends that we could potentially change. Well, we've highlighted one of them. I mean, one of them that I want to emphasize is like, listen, people, atheists can affirm the existence of abstract objects. Okay, just deal with it. So I just want to say that, and in fact, many authors have argued that abstract objects pose serious challenges to theism. William Lane Craig is one of them. He thinks, the existence of abstract objects, if they were to exist, would pose a challenge to God's sovereignty and his aseity. And I'm actually inclined to agree with him in that regard. And Felipe Leon has argued that, and lots of others have argued that. So that's one problem. I, I want to think of others because this is a time where we could issue reform.
Yeah, so I'm struggling to think of others as well. Um, maybe we just should take it on notice. Maybe next time.
Yeah, I'd have to think about this further. Maybe we'll come back to this after we answer the next question. I'll have it stirring in the back of my mind.
Sure. Okay. Okay. So the next question, then, maybe not the final question, but the next question. So it's a bit of a challenge, Joe. I'm going to throw it to you first because you've seen this question before, Graham. So it's only fair. So you can only name two. That's the challenge. Okay. You can only name two. So what two resources would you each wants to point the audience to continue this conversation or look at atheism and its philosophical roots? Joe, you first.
Well, one of them we've kind of already spoiled. We've spoiled it. But when I saw this message, my mind immediately went to it because it's like, I love it. It's J.H. Sobel's Logic and Theism. It's so good, and people need to check it out. So, Logic and Theism, that's number one for me. And then, hmm, number two, I think I'm going to go with, well, Graham's not going to plug his own work. So, I mean, I probably would go with one of Graham's books, but I'll go with one that he's edited because it gives you both sides. So this is kind of one that theists will be interested in. It's called Theism and Atheism: Opposing Perspectives in Philosophy. I think that's the title, and it's edited by Graham Oppy and Joseph Kopersky. What's his name? Okay, yeah, okay, good. And it's got a bunch of different. It goes through so many different aspects of philosophy of religion, and it gets like a theist to write on the topic and an atheist to write on the topic, and they're really good essays. They give really good. I just think it's really good. So I think people should look at it. It gives a nice comprehensive guide to kind of both sides of the issue from the atheist and theist perspective. So it's really good, and I highly recommend that. So those two are my choices. If I got more, I'd include some of Graham's books.
So the two books that Joe picked are big books. They're not books that you can read in a single sitting.
And also they're expensive.
And
Yeah.
so I'm going to recommend something that's quite short. I have always liked Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. And if you want to go back to a much earlier time and see how somebody was thinking about these things when it was kind of dangerous to come out and say that they were an atheist, I really think that it's one of the best things in philosophy of religion. You might need to get some help to find a crib of some sort to help you understand it, in which case I would recommend maybe having a look at the book that Paul Russell wrote about interpreting Hume's philosophy of religion to help you. But just reading it on its own is something well worth doing.
So that's one. You gotta wait. You gotta get.
I know.
Another.
Well, I already came out and said that I love Mackie's book, so
Oh yeah. Okay.
unless
I guess
we're going to give me a freebie for that, and I've got to pick a third thing. So,
You do have like the Atheism the Basics book, right? So wouldn't
Yeah.
that be?
so it's meant to be accessible. So I can. It's kind of hard to tell. I mean, some of my some of the other books I wrote were definitely not accessible to general readership, but I hope that Atheism the Basics is, and it really isn't too heavy on the philosophy. There's one chapter that's kind of fairly heavy going, but a lot of it's historical or looking at the bearing of social science on atheism and so on. So if I'm going to put a plug for one of my own books, it'll be that one, Atheism the Basics.
Nice. Well, there'll be links to all those in the description, so listener, viewer, check those out, please, as well as links to both Joe and Graham, so do check those out as well. Gents, obviously we're here today to look at atheism and its philosophical roots. Joe, I know you mentioned you might want to come back and pick up on the sort of biggest mistakes people often make when talking and looking at atheism. So is there anything we've missed, anything else you wanted to say? Please speak now or forever hold your peace.
For some reason I'm struggling on this one.
Okay, so I'll jump in with something. So I think that very often people, and maybe this is a kind of general public versus academic philosophy thing, people assume that atheists know nothing about religion, and in particular that they know nothing about your particular religion. And there are various ways in which this can go badly wrong. One point is that lots of people who are actively sort of arguing for atheism were themselves once religious and active members of religion, and knew their religion very well before they departed from it. I mean, I think, for example, although he's not an atheist, but think about Anthony Kenny, who was for many years a Catholic priest and then became an agnostic for an extended period of time. And maybe towards the end of his life he went back to Catholicism. But in the period in the middle when he was an agnostic, it wasn't that suddenly his knowledge about Catholicism evaporated and then magically returned when he went back to the faith. So there's another one.
That's a good one. I mean, this is kind of the same thing that I said earlier, but like atheism just doesn't entail moral anti-realism, as we've been talking about. There are lots of different non-theistic theories of moralities, of objective morality or stance-independent moral truths. So that's another one to keep in mind. But I think that's all I got.
Yeah. Well, we've been going for a while.
No, I appreciate it.
Kind of, well, at least I'll speak for myself. I'm kind of running out of steam. So.
That's all good. I mean, we've got 3 time zones, right? We've done really well to kind of bring this together through an alarm, which I'm sure will have been edited out, so the listener and viewer won't know, but we survived an alarm, which is fantastic, and got through that in one piece. Graham and Joe, it's been an absolute delight to talk to you both, so thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me back.
Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.